Let's see, is it 6?
Hi, folks. For those coming in, we'll be starting in a minute or so, just so everyone gets situated. Okay, so since it's about 6:01 and I also want to respect our speaker's time, I'll be starting now. But hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's program on Salmon 101 and how they're the lifeblood of the tribes here in the Pacific Northwest. For those who don't know, my name is Teresa Mai, and I am the wildlife intern here at Oregon Wild. For those who are new, we are a nonprofit focused on protecting and restoring the wildlands, wildlife, and rivers here in the state of Oregon. I'm hoping to make this as a foundation and as a building legacy for our current generation, but also for our future generations as well. So for tonight, I know we have a very exciting webcast, and I'm excited to be your MC, but I'm most excited to introduce our speaker, Jeremy FiveCrows. They are a Nez Perce tribal member, and ever since they were little, being raised in the Nez Perce Reserve, they learned how much of commitment they have towards conservation. And fun fact, they spent 2 years in Norway, which even strengthened their commitment to conservation even more. So they often joke that they're probably the only tribal member that know fluent Norwegian. So, that's pretty cool. And along with that, they are currently the the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission spokesperson, and they've been in this position for over 20 years. So during their tenure, they got to advocate, help elevate the commission's hard work on protecting the rivers, but also most importantly, the salmon in the Columbia River Basin, which covers over 7 states and even 2 countries. So now with that in mind, before we begin, I want to provide a land acknowledgement in this space. So first and foremost, I want to provide gratitude to the land itself and for those who have lived here since time immemorial, which includes the Yakima, Umatilla, Nez Perce, and the Warm Springs tribe that make up the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission to this day. I not only want to provide gratitude to the land itself, but I want to also be grateful for the places of commerce, of art, of science, industry, and community that are built upon these lands. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the continuing presence of Indigenous people today, in addition to the historical events, including the colonial legacies and wrongdoings such as forced removal that continue to have significant repercussions to this day. Now, to provide some context, back in 1855, the 4 tribes, the Yakima, the Nez Perce, the Warm Springs, and the Umatilla tribes, have signed a treaty with the United States ceding millions of acres of their homelands in exchange for peace. Now, among these treaty rights included a right that the tribes have always defended because it's always been their right, which was the right to fish along their homelands, whether it's on or off the reservation. Now, this is a very important right because it relates to salmon, because as salmon continue to decline due to stream disturbances, but also most importantly, climate change, these 4 tribes are coming closer than ever to defend, first of all, their first food, but also it is known as the lifeblood of the tribes in the Pacific Northwest. In tonight's program, we'll be discussing the cultural, the historical, the ecological importance of salmon and how the protection and restoration of these species are uniquely connected to cultural restoration and tribal sovereignty as well. So with that in mind, I want to thank Jeremy for joining us this evening and for giving us this opportunity to create a space of communal learning and growth. So before we get started, which I'm very excited about, I got 2 housekeeping issues. Well, not issues, but first of all, if you got a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A tabs. I typically say the earlier the better, but really, whenever the dot strikes, just feel free to drop it in so us Oregon Wild folks can organize those questions and get to them the best we can. Also, number two, if you're wondering, oh, I'm going to watch it live, or you might come back to it later, or you might not even be here today, we will send an email to all registrants tomorrow with the recording. We'll also have it on our wild blog at oregonwild.org. So, with that in mind, I am now excited to pass the mic over to Jeremy FiveCrows to begin this program.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, and I am very excited to be here tonight to be able to talk about a couple of things that I'm really kind of very passionate about, and that's salmon and healthy rivers. And when Oregon Wild asked to talk about this, it actually was kind of timely because I was working on another project. We were preparing, talking kind of about this similar issue, but kind of in a bent about how salmon are part of tribal culture, but relating it to telling that story through food. And so actually that's what it's kind of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, is really telling this story through our connection to food. And so let me see if I can get this started. All right, so is that sending? Can you see that?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so the Nez Perce. My name is Jeremy FiveCrows. I grew up on the Nez Perce Reservation, and in Nez Perce there's a term called "Wetes Pema Ewes," which means I am of this land. And so that's what I'm going to be really talking about tonight, is like what it means to be part of the land, and how that's shaped tribal cultures and cultures all over the world. So I grew up on the Nez Perce Reservation. This is my last name, FiveCrows. This is where I got that name. This is Chief FiveCrows. He was a Cayuse chief. Cayuse were the neighboring tribe to the Nez Perce, just over the border, and they're in northeastern Oregon. And there was a lot of intermarriage between those particular tribes. And yeah, he was my where I got my last name, and kind of like my connection to not only to Oregon, but to kind of like the tribal culture here. I'm going to start off with showing, there was a mention about just like how big the Columbia Basin is. And all of these states fit. Oh, and actually, I guess you can't see, that's New Hampshire at the very top, but it's black on black, so you can't see. But yeah, like when we think about how the size and scope of the Columbia Basin, I mean, this is like a big area, and right there in the middle, about the size of Wisconsin, is the ceded lands of the 4 member tribes. And so I work for the Fish Commission, and there are 4 tribes, which are the Yakima, the Umatilla, the Warm Springs, and the Nez Perce, that all kind of share a variety of attributes that kind of put that we work a lot together. We all speak a form of a Sahaptin language. There's lots of cross-cultural intermarriages between these 4 tribes. They're all salmon-based societies, and then they also, all these 4 tribes all share a common language in their treaties, giving them the right to fish at all their usual and accustomed fishing areas. And so this not only includes their on the reservation, but in the darker or the lighter colored areas, or those are the lands that were ceded to the United States of the treaty. But it can extend much further if there's historical precedent of that tribe hunting or fishing in broader areas. In fact, historically, my tribe, the Nez Perce, they were documented to become all the way to Oregon City, to Willamette Falls, to harvest lamprey. So they can still do that today because of this treaty. And so really this area, kind of the size of Wisconsin, and it's the heart of kind of salmon country. particularly today because there were a number of dams that blocked salmon. And so this is really kind of like the heart of where salmon can still return to. Um, so I keep mentioning the salmon. I mean, it's like, and that kind of basis, our connection to salmon is really for the food. The food is what connects us to this place. It's what kind of like our bodies were made out of, our culture and our language, our travels throughout the year. They were all based on this connection to hunting, gathering, fishing, just kind of in the obtaining food. And so we treat it not only as like this gift from the earth that's sustaining us, but it kind of defines our culture. And saying that, it's like it's not unique to the tribes. This is a photo of a variety here on the left. This is a picture of a feast, a Hawaiian luau. In the upper right is a Midsommarfest in Sweden, and below is a Christmas feast from Ethiopia. And if you look at every one of those, the cuisine there that's represented in these photos, you can not only get a lot of cultural history of like that these are the traditions that culture did, but it tells you something about the land, the environment, the ecosystem that was from that place, and how the people learned how to connect, make use of what nature was able to provide, or just like naturally provided in that area. So that connection of food was is exhibited right there in right on the table. And the tribes, this is not we did this the same way, and what we call it is the first foods. And so these are the four representative foods that represent all the foods that the tribes eat in this area. So there's Waikanish, which means salmon, and that represents not only salmon, but all the other animals and, or not animals, but the other fish that they eat. There's lamprey and sturgeon and trout. Yamash is represented by deer, and this could represent, and it represents all game. So elk and moose and rabbits. Those are kind of in that group. Camas, which is the root, that represents all the roots, and we knew the huckleberries represents all of the berries, and together these are the first foods. And right there in the center, chush is water, and that kind of like is always given the place of honor at tribal feasts and in the religious ceremonies, because water is life. Without it, none of this would be here. None of the foods would be here. People would be able to survive. So that's kind of there right in the middle. And traditionally, how this worked was at the feast, to celebrate a first salmon or a first kill for the young men, or the first huckleberries for the young women. There were feasts and ceremonies for that, and those always begin with a prayer and blessing on water, and then everyone drinks water, and then they're given, and then all of these foods are distributed in this clockwise order: salmon, deer, camas, and huckleberries. And I'm going to show this next slide here is automatic. This is a film that was probably filmed maybe in the mid 1940s at the Salilo Longhouse, and this is exactly the scene you would see if you were to go to the Salilo Longhouse and today. But there would be singers, people gathered around in the circle. The men would be passing out the meat and the fish. The women would be passing out the roots and the berries in a big circle for the feast. And so that this really hasn't changed over since time immemorial of this tradition of this connection through food. So so really this land and the foods here, it shaped our culture, and it also kind of taught us how to live appropriately on the earth. And so in our view, in return, nature, by thinking about taking care of sustaining nature, that nature provides us with the foods that reciprocate and do that, and help us to survive and continue. And so this is, I like this photo. This is the communal nature of this food. Like, it wasn't just an individual going out and fishing and then they would take care of the fish and it would just be for their family. It was really this big community event of getting all of these foods. And so here are some women that are preparing the salmon, probably to dry, by gutting and filleting them. This is a photo of Celilo Falls, which is now underwater behind the Dalles Dam. But it was really this center point of tribal fishing culture, to be able to do harvests here, and for a variety of fish throughout the run. In fact, actually, I was going to back up because I skipped the slide here. And so the four primary fish or salmon that were caught by the tribes were the Chinook salmon, and they tend to be the biggest in size and number, and they up until Grand Coulee Dam was built, which kind of it extincted this run, but they were called June hogs, and some of those Chinook in that run could be more than 100 pounds. And in comparison, nowadays, if we get a salmon that's 25 or 30 pounds, we're like really, it's really impressive. But historically, they got much bigger. And the next is sockeye. They're the ones that are very known for like the bright red color. They come earlier in the year, and which actually makes them a lot more susceptible to, unfortunately, the climate change, because they're not very temperature tolerant, or they're tolerant of higher temperatures. Coho, those tend to be a lot smaller salmon, returning in large numbers. Today, though I was talking to the fishery manager from the Yakima Nation the other day, and they said that they were the coho that were being caught today were averaging about 7 pounds. This past week, so much smaller than the Chinook. And then steelhead, which historically were kind of not considered salmon, but with genetics and more research, finding out they are in the salmonid family, and they are actually ocean-going rainbow trout. So they're just the regular rainbow trout, that their evolutionary history has turned them anadromous. So they travel to the ocean just like the other salmon, and that's where they develop their big size from all the resources in the ocean, and then return and spawn. And unlike so Chinook, sockeye, and coho, they all they die right after they spawn. But the steelhead, they actually can, if they can survive going through the system again, they'll go back to the ocean and then come back again to spawn multiple times. I'll go back. So I was right here. So that's what they would be fishing for here in the Celilo and throughout the basin area. And here, this is a photo from, this is in the Yakima territory, probably up in the mountains around in the Cascades, of the upper areas where they'd be picking huckleberries in the summer months, where it was nice and cool, and a good time of year to be up at the high elevations, setting up the whole camp there. And once the huckleberry season was over, then they were able to move down into other areas. And then here, this is the number of roots that were being dug. There was a lot of the starch, the carbohydrates that were consumed were primarily these roots. So digging and preparing those by mass quantities of these, made into dried, roasted, candied, kind of like candy, caramelized in fire pits, made into like little cakes. So this was a pretty important food as well, along with the salmon. So this food connection really kind of defined us, but in ways that's like really connected to the land. And so a lot of all the bands, the tribes, the small groups throughout the region were named kind of like a lot after the rivers that they primarily wintered at. So that's that's how we got a lot of these band names. And my personal band is called the Escapo, which means people of Asaka. And Asaka this is a photo of the Clearwater River in Idaho, and it's the name of the confluence between the North Fork of the Clearwater, which is the one that goes to the left, and the Middle Fork of the Clearwater, which is the one that goes up the center of the photo. And the Asaka is the name of the little village right there at that point. And so that's where my maternal grandparents, family, that's where all of my people came from there. The Wanapum, that the tribe that's which means, that translates as people of the river. They live they were from the Hanford Reach area, that you can see their longhouse on the river. The Walulapum people, they lived right there at like Wallula Gap, where along the Columbia, near the border of Oregon and Washington, where the Columbia flows out of Washington and becomes the Oregon-Washington border. And the Wayampum, or the people of Wayam, that's the people that permanently lived at Celilo Falls year round, were called the Wayam. And but because of the nomadic nature of the cultures, there were tribes from all over the region would annually travel to Celilo Falls to harvest salmon there. So that was kind of like the setting, and this connection, this kind of age-old connection that the tribes have had with this place, and our culture was defined by it, and our foods, and just our whole way of life. And after contact with this whole system was really changed, and there was a lot of development, and those developments, while they benefiting some people, they had a very large impact on the tribes, as well as the resources upon which they depended. And so this included just like over harvest. This is a photo of some of the canneries, of a cannery, and some of these canneries, they would, because it's a big industrial process, it was more cost effective to just over harvest, or take more salmon that they could actually process, so they didn't risk slowing or turning off the kind of the assembly line type process that they had, because salmon were so abundant, it didn't matter if they went to waste, and you could just push them back into the river. So a lot of fish being taken that way. In fact, that's when the June hogs were so sought after in this era, because it didn't take very many. I mean, one of those 100-pound fish could fill a whole bunch of tins of salmon, and so they were, that was pretty prized. Agriculture has had a big effect on both water quality and quantity that have impacted the region since contact, as well as like dredge mining and logging impacts. There during the kind of the gold rush era, whole riverbeds were dredged for the search for gold, completely destroying all these spawning grounds in some of the upper tributaries, and then all the sediment killing like, smothering eggs or making changing the habitat so it would cause salmon decline, as well as initial logging in inappropriate ways that produced a lot of erosion, which also would bury eggs from erosion events or whatnot. And then population pressure, and then kind of like now probably kind of the big one that's often in people's heads is the hydro system. And this next slide I'm going to show, it's kind of a weird, it's an old slide, but it shows it's going to show the dams as they got built in the Columbia system. And so here you can see, this is the start of the map of the Columbia and the Snake. And here, let's get this started. So yeah, I was surprised at me watching all of those being built, and it's really changed, particularly the main stem and the lower main stem of the Columbia and the lower main stem of the Snake, from kind of living rivers into a series of lakes. Historically, a salmon that was born in Idaho, it would take about two weeks to get flushed through the system, just by natural river flow. Today, that same journey could take more than 2 months, and a lot of times they actually have to swim with out of their own energy reserves, and pass through all of the dams. And so I'm really a changed system. And adding to that problem is that Grand Coulee is the top circled one, Dworshak, which is the middle circled, and Hell's Canyon dams, all none of them have fish passage. So effectively, all of the salmon habitat upriver of all of those areas has been erased. And so, like I said earlier, that the tribe ceded lands really represent the heartland of where salmon can still return to. And this is a kind of this shows like just how steep of impact that was historically. At contact, the estimates range anywhere between 15 to 20 million salmon per year were returning to the Columbia Basin. And you see that the very sharp drop. And Bonneville was the first on the Columbia main stem down here which was built in 1937 or 38. So most of the decline had actually happened before the hydro system was even built. So really, this was habitat degradation and over harvest just tanked the numbers initially. But if and in fact, some of those, like the fish wheels and some of the land use things, had changed. If those would have been implemented, the salmon could have bounced back. They've bounced back from the glacial floods and ice age floods and whatnot, and they could have bounced back. But while they were already kind of down these low numbers, then all of a sudden that's when the hydro system started to be developed. So it kind of like kicked them while they were down. And last year, the number there were only around 1.2 million salmon that returned. So really just this steep change to the resource, and then by reflection, a steep change to the tribes whose kind of our whole culture is developed around this abundant salmon. So going back to these bands, here's mine, the Escapo. Today, this is the same, what it looks like today. And you'll see in the very upper left corner that's Dworshak Dam. So that's one of the dams I said that doesn't have any fish passage. It's the tallest vertical axis dam in the world. In North America. It's 770 feet tall. and there's no fish passage, and the village is all gone because to make up for the fact that they killed all of that salmon habitat in that whole river system. The below you'll see, or at the confluence, are two major hatcheries. There's a salmon hatchery and a steelhead hatchery to kind of make up for that. So very, just kind of like erased the tribal presence there. In fact, growing up, that reservoir is surrounded by national forest lands and wilderness areas. And my family, we would go up there just like trout fishing or camping all the time. And it wasn't until years later that my dad had pointed out that he asked, like, if I knew why my grandpa would never come with us when we would go on those camping trips. And it turned out it was because he couldn't bear to see these streams. Up there are still these pristine, crystal clear water streams that there's nothing wrong with them, but they would never, that he fished for salmon as a young person, that would never see salmon again. And so that kind of always, it was too sad for him to even see that place, so he would never come with us. Here's the Wanapum people that I talked about earlier, and today we all know that the Hanford Reach, the Wanapum were actually just moved aside, and they were relocated to the reservoir next to Priest Rapids Dam to make way for now, the most polluted place in America, where all of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. Wallulapum, historically was this big, trade route and passage area. And today is just because of the slack water is now, there's a kind of a lonely highway, and most people, it's just the barges that go through there, not really even knowing that there was a human presence there since time immemorial. And then here, the last one of those is the people that lived at the YM, the people at Celilo, and then here today, here backed up behind the Dalles Dam, and here the roar that used to be heard for miles away of the falls is silenced under these the still waters of the reservoir. And you can still see in the right side, there's still a little tribal village there that still exists today. Kind of like belies the fact that it used to be kind of like the Wall Street of the Indian world in its heyday. And these things, these are all impacts that have happened, outside of our region, but right here in our backyard, like I mentioned earlier, Willamette Falls. Historically, Willamette Falls here, right up the river a few miles from Portland, was this center of tribal commerce and trade and harvest of salmon and lamprey and intermarriages and cultural events. And I like, when I was going through to find these photos, here's some of the earliest photos. It was mainly about all of the Indians fishing from scaffolds on the dams. And by 1846, it's like during the Oregon Trail period, as development started happening here, you can still see some of the buildings, but still out on the opposite bank, there's tribal people that are still there represented. There's some teepees and some people out there. 4 years later, Oregon City still continued to grow, but there's still at least the acknowledgement of this tribal presence you can see there in the foreground. And then just like not even 40 years after this painting was taken, here was Willamette Falls, completely, encroached by industry, to the point where today often I'll give presentations and mention Willamette Falls to people, and the fact that here that was the second largest waterfall in America is right here in our backyard, and they don't even know that there's a waterfall there anymore. So it really speaks to like the disconnection, like the successful disconnection in our mind of the river from just kind of like who we are, and our identities. And I think that this disconnect is kind of evidenced, I'll bring it back to food, is in our modern diet. How how, I don't know. And I'm not that I'm saying I'm a perfect hero. I mean, I go to Fred Meyer and I'll buy a frozen pizza, but I have no idea where the wheat was grown for that crust, and where the tomatoes were grown for the sauce, or where the cows lived for that cheese. Like, I have zero idea. It's just that it's just, just food that I eat, and it's lost its connection to the land where it comes from, to me personally. And so, that's why food, salmon, these foods are so important to the tribes, is because it not only unites us with our ancestors and what they did and the lives that they lived, but it's also what keeps our culture alive, to be able to continue to be reminded of that this is part of who we are. It's part of the gifts that the earth gives people in this area. So earlier I showed you the decline of the salmon in from the 1855, where there were 15 to 20 million salmon each year. This graph shows the kind of the period from during the hydro period, from 1938, when Bonneville was completed, through 1980. And 1980 was and it happened previously in a couple of times, but 1980 was kind of like the wake-up call here, I think, of when salmon went below 500,000 salmon of any type had returned to the Columbia. And this was, kind of like this, this potential disaster. People were talking about, are these salmon going to go extinct? They're just hanging on by a thread. But fortunately, I think that it came at the same time when there was a lot of attention given to the environment. It was in the 70s that the Environmental Protection Agency was passed, the Clean Water Act, and also a lot of tribal efforts for self-determination. And so it was kind of like the perfect opportunity for when that to happen, to kind of this call to action to do something, to help reverse this decline and prevent this from happening, because losing the salmon would be so, it would be devastating to cultures that are built on salmon. So this is just a a scene of a watershed in the Umatilla, on the Umatilla Reservation. And you think, how do you restore something that's so multifaceted, and how do you think about it, and how do you do this and not do it piecemeal, but kind of think of it as kind of a holistically. That was what the initially in the 80s, what the tribes were figuring out, was that all these separate problems that the salmon faced were never kind of put together into a big picture. So like the Forest Service would see problems in their area and try to address that, but the National Marine Fisheries would see a problem and do theirs, but there was no kind of whole holistic idea of how do we think about this as kind of a big system. And so that's when the tribes kind of came in and tried, thinking about how do we think of the land as this cohesive whole. And so as an example, what they did was they kind of pieced it according to the first foods. And I'll initially show you this. So the red line that goes across the Umatilla Reservation there in the map is the topography, the cross section of that line. So you see the Horseheaven Hills, that's on the Washington side of the Columbia River, and then you can see the dip at the Columbia, and then a little further the Umatilla, the Blue Mountains, Wallowa Mountains, and then there's the Big Plateau, Big Lookout Mountain, and then the steep dip is Hell's Canyon, where the Snake River flows. So if you think about their seated area, that's kind of the cross section. So what the Umatilla did was they just thought, well, let's just take this apart and treat it for, apply management thinking with a first foods model. And so the first one, the lowest one, you can see salmon and water. Well, anything that impacts salmon is going to be anything that happens in the river or in any of the direct riparian areas. And so their management decisions were based on focusing on that area to benefit salmon, knowing that by extension, if the water is good quality, healthy habitat and for salmon, it's going to benefit the resident fish, the trout, the crayfish, the aquatic insects that live there, all of those. So it kind of gets covered under that, the salmon first food. And then the next elevation up, the roots applying it the same way. So thinking about each zone of their area, thinking about the food, what is the food that's harvested there? How do we help it, knowing that it's going to spill over and help all of the creatures there? And so this thinking has been, it's had a big impact in salmon restoration. I'm going to give a couple of examples of where this has been in action. This photo is it's called Crooked River, and it's in Idaho on the Nez Perce Reservation. And you'll see the kind of the just straight line back and forth is all mine tailings, and the mine closed in the 1920s or 1930s. So you can see how kind of those tailings are not, hardly anything can grow on them. I mean, the fact that they were still that much exposed rock and debris, even after, almost, 90 years, show how, it was not a beneficial part of the environment or the ecosystem. And then there were a lot of problems with with flooding and erosion and whatnot. And so the Nez Perce tribe, they applied this kind of thinking of how do we return this to a more holistic model to benefit all the creatures from it. And this is mid-project, and you'll see all of the tailings are gone, and the lead up to this was so fascinating too, because on all of those the artificial meanders, they had tribal youth, hundreds of tribal youth coming multiple times during this, doing gathering up all of the mussels in the water, doing electroshocking and catching every little minnow and any tiny fish to be able to be put into the bypass river to preserve them so it didn't kill. They minimize the amount of aquatic loss of aquatic life for that, and then kind of just recreated this meandering river that was connected to its whole floodplain. And this is what what it looked like last year. So really kind of helping return the river to its natural state for the benefit of salmon, but also for the benefit of all these other creatures that depend on that. And this is another example. This is here in Oregon, the Warm Springs tribe, a rancher back in the 30s or 40s had straightened this river along the outside edge. And so the area was really disconnected from its floodplain, and the water table was low, and it wasn't really beneficial for salmon. And so the Warm Springs tribe, working with the current landowner, it was a multi-year project to essentially put the meanders back into these rivers. This is the same a photo from a part of the stretch that they had rebuilt, and really this kind of this natural system. And once it's this thinking is that once nature kind of can get a foothold back into a natural system, that it'll take over and kind of do things in a more natural way, and that's what we're seeing. So going back to this, it's after the implementation of these tribal programs, as well as state programs and federal programs from advocacy of wanting to protect salmon, that we've seen these increases in number and of all the runs. In fact, Coho they had been extirpated in Idaho, and thanks to the efforts of the Nez Perce tribe, they have a big enough run that it supports not only a sport, they're naturally spawning again, and they also are, there's a tribal fishery and a sport fishery for coho where they've been extinct for, I think, 70 years. So this really kind of hits home what our vision for the future is. Like, we want to continue to fish and to maintain our connection to this resource, to this land, and to continue this, this way of life that had been given, that we'd lived since time immemorial. And we can do that, in this modern setting as well. I mean, living as as modern Americans as well, but this kind of continual reminder that we're still a part of this place that we call that where we're from. And so that leads me into the kind of the conclusion here is that there's this idea here that's called, so earlier I talked about, the Wanapum, the Walulapum, the Wayampum. The Pum means people. Waikonishpum means salmon people. And historically wasn't a tribe called the salmon people, but the Fish Commission, we kind of coined this with the idea that if you live here in the Northwest, you're Waikonishpum. You're a salmon person, because salmon impact this region so significantly. And even if you don't eat salmon, land use is dictated around salmon, and the hydro system has impacts with salmon. So it impacts us, but it also connects us all. And so our task is to not only help people realize that, but also to have that guide their actions. And with the idea that here's this quote that I like, in the end, we will conserve only what we love love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. So our hope is that, one, it's part of our responsibility as tribal members to teach people that live here why these things are important, and then from that, hopefully, though, everyone hearing this will kind of take this into their heart, realize look around, what does this place mean, develop that love that kind of fosters that understanding, and out of that love will hopefully, drive the advocacy and willingness to do some of the conservation, which, I mean, some of what needs to still be done is pretty significant, and so it will take a lot of effort. And so I think unless you have a deep love and inspiration from that, it might be easy to dismiss it. And so what we want is people to kind of fall in love with this place, and kind of develop that sense of place. Often we talk about letting nature inspire us, and to kind of develop our wonder, curiosity, bring awe and that back into our experience, and looking at the world. But and then also to learn from the people who've lived here in this area since time immemorial. Not to say to copy tribal culture, but by learning about their connection, their wisdom, their teachings, it tells you a little bit about this place and how to make changes in your own lives to live an appropriately an earth-friendly way in this area that you call home today. And I like this quote this is from a Yakima elder in their climate change impacts report, in their introduction. And it just says, for many generations, you will be challenged with a changing climate. But always remember, since time immemorial, we have looked to our elders for their wisdom and guidance. And with our children, we will always see hope. And so that's really kind of, I think, what drives our thinking, and hopefully, the kind of the broader population is this kind of learning from the past, but also doing things out of a hope for a better world for our children. And I'm going to close with this great piece, the simple piece of what kind of drives this work for us from a Yakima. He's a river chief, Wilbur Slockish from the Klickitat band, and he's lived his whole life on the Columbia River, right where the Klickitat flows in, and has just made his whole life has been fishing for salmon on the Columbia River.
I got told of this by one man in prison for that Wounded Knee occupation, as they were going to do another study on our people. His name was Hobart Garneau. And we were sitting there and I was talking with him, and I said, God, they like to do studies on our people. I said, I wish they'd conduct a study of what we did so wrong to be punished with their presence. He turned and looked at me, youngster, did you ever stop to think maybe he sent them over here for us to teach them? Look what they have done to their places in Europe. Maybe he sent them over here for us to teach them to reconnect to the land again because of what it provides us, because they have lost that connection to the land. And I thought about that. So that's why I do a lot of public education. I do a lot of that based on his words. They need to remember, the land means something, not just free market extraction.
Yeah, I love that quote. So I'm just going to close with this reminder. When I talked earlier that the Wetes Pima Ewes, I am of this land, that the tribes, we believe that we're connected and it's part of our culture. But hopefully what you gleaned from this presentation is the fact that we're all of this land. If you call this place home, it's a part of you, whether you realize it or not. And to hopefully, I encourage you to put down as deep of roots as you can to learn more and fall in love with this place, because that's kind of like our hope and our kind of to fix a lot of the problems that we've been experiencing. And it's kind of like what the earth deserves there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that great presentation. And I know for us from Oregon Wild, we're really focused on supporting Indigenous voices in terms of conservation. So Danielle, can you take it away with some Oregon Wild updates too?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy. That was wonderful and just profound and beautiful. So thank you so much for sharing that presentation with us. And I will be very quick because I want to get us right to Q&A and have as much time as possible for Jeremy to answer questions. I just want to do a quick introduction, especially for those who are new to Oregon Wild. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Danielle Moser. I'm the Wildlife Program Coordinator for Oregon Wild. And as Teresa said, we're working to protect and restore our fish and wildlife, our forests and waters. And as Jeremy pointed out, also working really hard to ensure that people do feel connected to the land, to the things in the biological diversity and the reasons that a lot of people love Oregon and call this place home. For our wildlife program in particular, I work on a range of issues and topics, from advocating for the recovery of native keystone species such as sea otters and wolves and beavers and many more, to ensuring that those who make decisions about our state's fish and wildlife are really reflecting and incorporating, best available science and the public's values and ethics when it comes to their management practices. And finally, just working to help ensure that we have healthy, intact habitat that's able to support this abundant wildlife we hope to have. Because, even with fish or other species, if we don't have healthy habitat, it's very difficult to have healthy, thriving wildlife. For Oregon Wild staff, salmon is one of those species or issues that surround salmon that kind of reaches many of our different staff and is incorporated into several of our programs. So though I'm the wildlife person and I definitely have things that focus specifically on salmon, our breadth of work really is about, providing input. For example, if there's a species conservation and recovery plan, if there's ever rulemaking or a petition or a proposal, especially for industry or for some other thing related to extracting from nature, to provide input, especially as it relates to habitat and salmon impacts. We advocate all the time for improved water quality and habitat. For example, I sit on the beaver management working group that's being hosted by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, obviously both for the benefit of beaver, but also for all the benefits that recovering beaver have for streams and wetlands, and in fact, coho salmon. And then finally, we are always working to reform our forest practices and make sure that they're sustainable and that, we are not doing further harm to our rivers and streams. And also engagement on dam removal across Oregon. So I just wanted to give a quick snapshot, especially for those who might be new to Oregon Wild and joining us tonight, about who we are. And if you want to learn any more, connect with any of us, just feel free to check out our website, oregonwild.org. But thank you, and let's get back to some questions for Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, for that quick recap. Of course, I'm seeing everyone flooding the chat right now about the great presentation Jeremy is doing. So heads up, Jeremy. There's a lot of questions too, understandably. So we have our first question, which is a great question to start with. So this is all great visioning to increase salmon numbers and to support other first foods. What impact will climate change and warming waters have on your work and on the salmon?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. In fact, actually, I kind of run out of time about the kind of bringing up that topic. But you remember the initial slide showing the steep decline of salmon, and then we kind of kicked them while they're down with the hydro system. But then we've been doing all this work to kind of slowly inching them up. But what it feels like now is, as the climate impacts have really started to become more and more significant, that we're again kicking the salmon while they're right when they were starting to seeing these changes. So that part's been pretty kind of disheartening and kind of frankly scary, because it's the whole thing I'm talking about is our first foods, which are the foods from this ecosystem. And if this ecosystem has changed, but we're still in the same place, like the Umatilla natural resources manager said, it's it feels like our first foods are leaving us behind, and that's that would be so earth shattering for tribal cultures based on these foods. So the initial plan for the tribes, and I talked about how it was a holistic plan looking at the whole life cycle of the salmon. It was a 25-year plan, and its goals were to reverse the decline of the salmon, which we accomplished. The other goal was to get to 4 million, which we didn't make, but it was a 25-year plan, and that ended in 2020. And so right now we're actually drafting the next 25-year plan, and that it will be almost exclusively on what do we do about climate change. There's some of the other issues that are still around. Some aren't, or some have been mitigated, but the climate change is going to be impacting the whole system, and it's a much bigger problem to fix, because we're just so many of the issues are baked into the system. It's not like we're gonna stop it. And so really a lot of the work is understanding how we can mitigate for these effects, prepare for them. Our system is built around a snow dominant watershed, where the winter precipitation is stored in the mountains as snow, and then in the summer it melts and flows downstream. But when it falls as rain, which has been in the past few years, it flows out the system as soon as it falls. So we have high water in a time when we normally didn't have high water, which impacts, washes away the eggs and the silts up things, because it's just not the time that it was designed for. But also then it makes in the summer such hot water higher water temperature. And like earlier I mentioned about the sockeye are very temperature sensitive. They're the ones that you've seen. I don't know if you've seen any of the photos around or videos of the salmon that are covered in white, like fungus, and that are covered in lesions. Those are mostly sockeye that are suffering from the high heat. In 2015, 99% of the sockeye that were destined to return to Idaho died in that heat event. So we're really working on, like, one, understanding that, but then there's only so much you can do to try to cool down a river the size of the Columbia River. But we can do smaller aspects of it, of, like, in these smaller riparian areas, doing things that encourage more, putting cover back along riparian areas, things like, putting meanders back in, retying streams to their groundwater, which tends to cool down the water, but also really identify and protect cold water refuges where colder rivers flow into the Columbia, and that kind of give resting spots for salmon, while they save their energy to go further up into the system. And so, but really it's a lot about kind of like, how do we kind of protect them, and, knowing what's going to, kind of worse is coming their way.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, for that answer. I know we hit the 7-minute mark. So for those folks who are busy, don't worry, there's a recording, so you can watch the rest of this Q&A. That will keep going too. So understanding there's still a lot of questions, Jeremy. So there is another one similar. So understanding for folks who are watching this, they're like, I wonder about eating and purchasing local salmon. I feel like I should not eat these fish because their numbers are so low. Does purchasing fish such as from tribal sellers at farmers market, is this too extractive, or does it really support local fisheries?
Oh yeah, great question. In fact, so the harvest, the harvest is so regulated. Like, at any given time, you could find out from state, tribal, and federal agencies exactly how many salmon have been caught by tribal fishers, by sport fishers, by by ocean fishers, trolls, and it's very, very regulated. And in fact, weekly during the salmon runs, all the harvest scientists and managers get together and look at forecasts, because the ultimate goal is we need to have enough salmon to return to kind of produce the next generation. So to fulfill the hatchery needs, for natural, for their wilds to escape into the wild to do that. And so there's this whole complicated system of, like, deciding how many fish that are safe to harvest. And in some years that could just be a few hundred, other years it could be thousands of them. It's all adjusted, but with the ultimate eye on just making sure that enough escape to do that. So that's so buying a salmon is, I'm a particularly one that's, and I'll advocate, of course, for tribal caught salmon because I think it's the best. But it is, you're not becoming part of the problem there. And the other thinking too is that, like, that earlier quote about learning to love something, that I think part of learning to love the salmon is actually making it a part of your body. Like, when you eat that salmon that's been caught, it's connecting you, not only, especially if you buy it from a tribal fisher, it's connecting you to this tradition that's like thousands of years old, that there have been these tribal fishers have been catching and trading salmon for that long, and you become part of that same history and that same legacy. And when you eat that and share that fish, it's now a part of your body. And I think that it continues to inspire people to, like, want to, like, protect them, because that it's them at that point.
Yeah, that's a great answer. This is a similar question. So I know you often talked about we are all of the land. So for folks wondering, how can we better teach that lesson? Because as one person who asked this question, it's here to sustain us and not for us to abuse. So how can we bring this word more to everyone else we know?
Yeah, I think it's like the whole Jane Goodall. There's a Jane Goodall quote where she said, if you hear, think globally, but act locally. And she said, don't do that because it'll fill you with gloom. To just do what you can in your place. And by doing that, and by making small changes that you can affect, that all of a sudden you'll come in contact with someone over there that, oh, look, they're doing something cool there, and someone's doing something cool over there. And then eventually the whole picture gets filled in. And I think that that's a lot of what I tell people is like, there's little things from, just like the basic planting native plants in your yard to being advocates that we can all do, just simply in our lives, to kind of like avoid being filled with kind of like a hopelessness and dread. And another thing that I really am an advocate for is, even if it's just like a pot on your patio, of like growing some food in your own space. Let the ground where you sleep at night, your plot of land, let it feed you. Even if it's like a simple, just like a few tomatoes, you're connected to this gift that the earth has just provided you. And I think let that kind of flow through, and that can be a start of like such a great inspiration that then will feed off other ways that you can look and see, and how you can connect and kind of like become an advocate and a voice for the earth.
Yeah, that's awesome. So for folks, if you want to think about starting a garden when the pandemic's still going, think about it. It might be a fun hobby on the side, So I guess this is a more serious question. So can you speak to the challenges right now of the Columbia River dams, and is there any likelihood that they'll be removed?
Yeah, so they are like a big challenge. I mean, you see essentially they've turned the system into like a bunch of lakes, and so we see problems with water temperature, with the flow, and then also kind of decisions being made, especially now with like as our energy needs have been changing and altering, that decisions get made that benefit energy production at the expense of salmon. So like it's kind of like this big kind of not elephant in the room, because everybody is still also talking about these impacts. They're particularly the ones that are kind of most talked about, I think, for removal are the lower Snake dams, the last 4 before they go to Idaho. The Idaho fish are like probably in the most trouble, and those 4 dams don't produce as much electricity as the other big Columbia River dams. They're run of the river dams, so they don't do any flood control. So it's really to make a little bit of electricity, and they turn Lewiston, Idaho into a seaport, and that's kind of like, I think that's why they're being targeted there. It was interesting. Years ago, there was some initial hearings about, well, should we breach these? And we at the Fish Commission that we would go to the hearings just to set up informational booths. And I grew up in an era, like my dad, he experienced a lot of racism, even though he lived on an Indian reservation. But there was a lot of racism still from the non-Indians that lived there. But I was young enough, fortunately, to like not really experience that a lot. But it wasn't until those dam breaching hearings that I had my first taste of like direct, in my face, like anti-Indian racism. And I think people can get so fixated on the idea of the dams, that they're progress, that they represent progress, and that we're asking people to like go back to the dark ages almost, is what they think that we're asking them, that it brings up kind of like an ugliness. And so I hopefully that as we work together and come up with solutions, that we can work. I mean, I think there are solutions that can benefit everybody, and particularly for the benefit of the salmon.
I guess I want to end this on, because I know you mentioned like there's so much challenges in advocating for salmon. So someone mentioned like understand this can be a gloom and doom, you know, when you think globally. So what keeps you going in this work and how can you stay so optimistic?
I know. Well, actually, I think by nature, I'm kind of a Pollyanna of like of just being an optimistic person. But actually, I just get so much value, I think, just from nature, and even I don't know. I guess I'm like chronically optimistic in that regard, and there's just something that's just kind of inspiring about it, and I think part of it is my, you know, I get the connection from like my ancestors of like this is my place, but also I'm not originally from Portland, but I like feel like a Portlander because I like look and learn and just be open to kind of like the wonder that surrounds us. I know I on my Instagram, half of my pictures are just like cool flowers that people grow in their yards in our neighborhood. And, you know, and I get so many thanks from people of like, oh, I never even like bothered to like look at some of these. And I'm like, you know, there's wonder and amazing things all around us if we're willing to, you know, kind of slow down and look.
Great words, Jeremy. And now I know folks are, it's amazing how many folks are still hanging on because I guess that's how much people really love this presentation too. So let me get us to the wrap up because I do want to respect our speakers' time, everyone else's time, especially since it's a Wednesday night. I'm gonna paste in these links and get into the wrap up. So let's get this started. Let me share my screen. Hope nothing bad happened with Zoom. And then, okay, and expand that. Okay, so as I mentioned before, if you can't tell quite yet, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission does a ton of awesome work. But as always, if you want to watch this recording again with these slides, an email will be sent tomorrow. It'll also be on the Wild blog at OregonWild.org. But back to the CRITFC. If you want to support them, they are also supporting cash donations. So you can go to their website. I put the links in the chat below. Right now, of course, they use the donations to fund their work with science, with restoration, with advocacy and education. But they're also very focused on helping the tribal fishers all along the Columbia River because of the pandemic and how it impacted healthcare accessibility, the children's learning, even just making a living right now. Because as we mentioned, climate change, heat wave, well, they just impacted all the fish. So if you want to put in a cash donation, please go to their website and do so. If you want to also support Indian fishers, as Jeremy mentioned, you can always buy from them to be part of this awesome life cycle of the salmon. The CRITFC has a list of locations along the river. Sockeye is kind of low right now, but there's also Coho, Steelhead, Chinook right now as well. And now with that in mind, I want to, first of all, thank Jeremy FiveCrows for being such a fantastic guest speaker and facilitating this great space of communal learning and growth. But I also want to thank everyone else here for hanging on this presentation, being engaged most of all. And I want to say thank you so much, everyone, especially Jeremy and Danielle for being here. And remember, we are all of this land. And for that, thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.